Hi folks, welcome to Teaming with Possibility. My name's Simon Dowling and this is episode 8. So in this episode, I want to explore a question that came up for me with a leadership team I was working with very recently, and during one of the breaks, one of the members of this leadership team, we were working on helping them to become a team that truly hums. We were spending a couple of days together building up some understandings and some commitments and designing their way of working together. And he asked me this question. He said, Simon, when it comes down to it, what do you reckon really sits at the heart of every great team that you've worked with? You work with a lot of different teams. What do you reckon? And part of me wanted to just pull over to the side of the room and have a look at the framework and the model that I'd been using with them, working through, and kind of answer the question, anchoring it back in that. But I stopped for a moment and I thought, you know what? If I had to boil it down, I think there are two things in particular. And they both start with the letter C. The first is connection. And by connection, I mean connection to each other, connection to what each of us brings to the table, connection to our purpose and our role, what we're here to do, connection to the difference we make, connection to our possibilities. In other words, where we're shooting for, the aspiration, we're all connected to that future and working at it together. So that's the first one, connection. The second, which also starts with the letter C, is co-creation, which has actually been on my mind a lot lately. Co-creation, and he kind of looked at me a little quizzically by what I mean by that. And I said, I don't just mean collaboration. I don't just mean the ability to cooperate, because I think a lot of teams, when they think of collaboration, they're thinking primarily of their ability to cooperate. But true teams are the ones that really tap into the juice of co-creation, creating stuff together. And that's different from cumulative, that's a hard word to say, cumulative collaboration, which I'll explain in a second. And it's also different from, even worse, co-reporting, which is very different from co-creation. And I think that's where some teams get this wrong. That's why this is the C I want to explore in this episode today. What does it mean by co-creation, and how can we make sure that our team taps its full potential? Now, before we dive into that conversation, I've got a very quick favor to ask of you. That is, if you are finding this episode at all useful, at all valuable to you in your role, or you think there might be others who would find this interesting and useful as well, can I ask you to just take a quick second to hit the subscribe button, or leave a rating or a review, or hit the like button? And the reason for that, these aren't just purely vanity metrics for me. These are much more about, and you may or may not be aware, creating reach with this podcast. What I am really keen to do is reach as wide an audience as we possibly can here, not because I want the whole world to hear me, but because I hope that what we do in this podcast is useful and interesting to a wide range of people and leaders. So the more I get engagement back from you, the more we can build that audience. So if I can ask you to take just that moment to hit that button, that would be truly awesome. Much appreciated. Now let's get into the episode. Co-creation. Now, co-creation, when we talk about it, is a very deliberate choice of word, as opposed to perhaps the more commonly used words of collaboration and cooperation. Because co-creation points to something very specifically that some teams miss. Co-creation, to start with, is very different from cumulative creation, or what you might even describe as parallel play. And perhaps one way to think of this is, I don't know if you've ever played a game back when you were a kid. Liz, who, one of my colleagues, describes it as something that she used to do in art when the emergency teacher arrived. It was when you would fold up a piece of paper into different sections, 4, 5 or 6 sections, vertically down the page. You'd fold it all up into layers, and then you would take it in turns. The first person would draw, and the idea was you were drawing a character, maybe an alien, maybe a monster. The first person would draw the top layer, so that might be the head and their face. And then the next person you'd pass it to, you'd fold it over so they couldn't see what the person had just drawn. You'd then pass over to the next blank section, and that person would add in a layer. It'd be the neck, maybe the shoulders, and then they would fold it, hide it again, and then pass it around so the next person would add the next layer, which would be the torso, the body, maybe the arms, and so on and so forth, until you got to the bottom layer. And then once you'd done that, you'd unfold this piece of paper and you'd see what the group together had just created. And you'd have a laugh, or you'd look in kind of mild horror because it was just a complete mess on the paper. That is a great example of what I would call cumulative creation. We have 5 or 6 people each adding their piece to the final creation, but somewhat ignorant of what the others are doing at the same time. And so I'm doing my best contribution. All I can focus on is my section. I work hard on that, and then I pass it around, and it's a bit of fun. But that's really not that far removed, if you think about it, from the scenario where if we're in a team, maybe I'm the manager of the team or the manager of a project, or in an organization, when I say to you, hey, I need you to create piece X, I need you to create piece Y, and then when you send them through to me, I'll compile them, and that will then lead to us having an awesome presentation that we can share back with the board or send to the client, or the product that we can deliver. There you have another example of cumulative creation. And you might even say the creation is really being done primarily by me as the manager in that situation. I'm the one saying, okay, I know what we need to get to. I know what the finished product should look like. So now I'm just going to break it up and ask different people to contribute to it, which is really just breaking it down and resourcing the parts. A lot of teams get stuck in this as their working model. And I should sort of jump in at this moment and say there's not necessarily anything wrong with that for certain projects in certain situations. Maybe that's exactly how a team is designed and meant to operate. For some of its key pieces of work is that we just break up the work, we divvy it up amongst the different technical experts, they contribute it, and my role as the manager is to oversee, to massage together the finished product. That's the most efficient, effective way of working. That could well be the case in many situations. I think of my own business, there's probably plenty of situations where it's most efficient to do it simply that way based on a piece of work that we have. But do we get stuck then in that as our operating mindset? In other words, that I'm a contributor, and a lot of teams use this word, I'm a contributor, but what that word contributor suggests is that there's someone else who is kind of the chief architect, the chief author, the person who is pulling all of that stuff together. And so I almost yield my ability to shape the final outcome to that person or to that group of people. And so what we end up with is this mindset of cumulative creation. I do my bit, you massage it in to the finished product. Now that can then play out into the way team meetings are run, the way a whole project plays out. But what is it that you might be missing as a result of that dynamic? What is it that you might be missing? Because if you ask me, what you then create for yourselves is a world where the outcomes, the outputs, the results, the deliverables, the products, whatever you want to call it, are really heavily shaped by the architecture of one or two or a few people, as opposed to our ability to tap into and harness the perspectives and thoughts of many. And I reckon for anyone who is leading a team, anyone who is keen to influence the dynamics of a team and really tap the juice of innovation, of creativity, of being able to think differently from the status quo or the norms or the defaults within which we operate, the ability to challenge ourselves a little bit. Those are the teams, or that happens in the teams where co-creation rides strong. Our ability to sit around a table, metaphorically or literally, and smash out something completely different and look at it uniquely. I mentioned earlier in my intro to this episode that there's another perhaps evil of teams, and that is where we don't get to co-creation, we don't even get to cumulative creation because we get stuck in a world of co-reporting, which is where really when we come together as a group, we spend all of our time all talking about what each other is doing and what each other has done purely for the sake of understanding where each other's at, which sometimes again is useful, but if we use up all of our together time for co-reporting, then what does that leave energy for? Not much at all. It might all be very backward looking as opposed to forward looking, which is co-designing, co-creating. So in the balance of this episode, I guess I want to just play with the question, what does it take to really create an environment, a dynamic, a culture, the muscle of co-creation and co-design as a team? And I guess that does start with the question, before we look at the how, it starts with the question of where would that be useful? Where would it be great for us to be able to get multiple heads working on a problem, a question, a situation, an idea, a product, a way of working even? Because we don't want to simply get limited by the mindsets, the views, the belief systems of the few who are notionally in control of this business or notionally in control of this client account. So when and where do we want to harness co-creation? I think that's actually a great starting conversation for any team to have, is on what things, on what decisions, on what outcomes, on what products should we be genuinely coming together and co-creating, breaking open the kind of the default beliefs about how this should look, and starting with a question about how could it look? When do we do that? And if I go back to the example I started this episode with, the leader who was asking me what sits at the core of teams, that answer that I gave him really came from a realization that one of the things I'm obsessive about when I go in and work with teams is building a space. I'm trying to avoid saying creating a space, making a space, holding a space for that team where they can truly co-create, where there is no one voice in the room who dominates and drives the outcome or predicts it, but instead we hold the space and the time to co-create. So my passion for that then leads me to go, well, how do you make sure that you continue to hold this after I leave the room as a group, and that you don't have the most senior person in the room driving a predicted outcome for everybody that they're just now contributing to? So let's have a think now about how. And I think it starts with the first piece. Aside from when and where does this really seem useful for us? Like, where do we want to be able to do it? As an example, again, as we think of our strategy for the next 12 months, it would be great to actually harness and tap into the collective genius in this group and say, let's not come into this with any fixed views about what this strategy should look like. Let's not allow the views of the dominant, seniority to overly steer this conversation, but let's create space for us as a group to rip open and ask ourselves some questions and challenge the way we think about this. So I want to break this down into then four things I think this takes in practice, and try and get as practical as possible here. The first of which is you've got to be able to really clearly put a question, a problem statement, even an aspiration at the middle of the conversation. You've got to be able to put it as a really concrete thing in the middle that says, this is the question, this is the thing that we have to, as a group, tackle, and it is our collective job to tackle it. It's not my question that I'm trying to answer and I'd love your input. That's not co-creation, that's consultation. Instead, it is our question. And so that requires two things. The first of which is to be able to articulate what that question is. And I love watching a group actually start by wrestling to say, are we asking the right question here? Have we got the right problem statement identified? Let's get that clear first so that we all feel like, okay, now I'm comfortable with the question, I'm ready to proceed. So step one is, do we feel like we've got the question clearly articulated? And once you have, to put it somewhere so that it is really concrete. Now, by that, I mean, write it on a whiteboard, stick it up on a poster on the wall, put it, if you're online, put it on the screen, put it on a chat box, send it around in advance as an email. This is the question. Use that question as the heading in your agenda. So one of my favorite ways to structure agendas is using questions as the items, and it's the question that we collectively are wrestling with. It's no one person's question, it is our question. You see the shift that we're making there? So, I want to give examples here, but of course the examples could be like infinite. What would it look like for us if we were to flip the balance of revenue in our business or our product stream at the moment to go from 20% on this product to 80% on that product? What would that look like? What would it take? What is the most creative way in which we can reach a wider audience in terms of our market in 2023? How do we make everyone's lives 5% easier in 2023? I know I'm just making these up, but these are the sorts of questions that we're saying this is for us to work together on. So that's the first piece, is put it somewhere really concrete. And the other thing that I think great teams do is once they become addicted to this, they don't just name the question of the day, they start to set up a queue. Like maybe the first thing you do is you do a brain dump, a brainstorm together of what are all the questions we would love to be putting at the center of our conversations and making time for and treating with, sacred energy almost. What are those questions? Let's identify 10 of them, 12 of them, and then create a queue, maybe using again, some post-it notes on a wall, or using a Trello board if you're using that kind of tech, whatever it might be. But let's create the queue and then let's work through them. Pick one at a time, which actually leads me to the second idea here, or second tip, the second bit of the how question, which is to allocate time. So it's one thing to ask beautiful questions, gnarly questions, problems that need to be solved. But it's another thing, I think, entirely to make sure that you carve out time for it, because let's face it, most of us are time poor simply working through the stuff that is on our list of things we need to do today, the deliverables, the transactional stuff. Now, this is about saying we need to carve out time for creative energy, creative conversation, multi-voice conversation. And that requires a commitment of time. So when are you going to have this conversation? If we have team meetings, are we going to use every second meeting to do it? Are we going to use the first 30 minutes of every team meeting? Are we going to do it once a month and we're going to spend half a day and we're going to go off-site and we're going to get lunch? When are we going to do that? Or are we going to make sure that we carve out some concrete time? And maybe part of that is also implicitly choosing the where. Where will you do this so that you get the best kind of conversation? Carving out the time also means what preparation needs to be done in the lead up to that moment so that we have, again, the richest possible conversation. How will we gather some of that input? Will we use some sort of polling tool, or will we use a Google document, or will we use a Trello board, or will we simply use post-it notes on the wall? What is it? But so allocating time is actually more broadly allocating the space with which we can do this really well. But there's something else about allocating time. It's not just about saying, so let's make sure we make time for this. Not just about saying, let's carve out space for this. But the other part of this is time boxing it. In other words, let's harness this desire to come together and co-create something. Let's harness that and channel it by saying, let's give ourselves 2 hours to see what our 2-hour answer to this question is, or 2 weeks, or 3 days, or whatever it might be. But set yourself a time box on this. And the reason I say this is because for a lot of people, quite justifiably, and this is something I talked about in the last episode of this podcast where we talked about over-collaboration, a lot of people will hear the idea of co-creation and think, oh my gosh, this is decision-making by consensus. Things will take forever. We won't make a decision. It'll be watered down by the collective, etc., etc., etc. Now, there's a whole bunch of rules. I won't go into all the detail of them today about how do we avoid this becoming a watered down way of thinking. Instead, how do we make it a stronger way of thinking? Part of that is time boxing. So let's not allow ourselves to just keep kicking the can down the road on when we're going to make a decision about this or when we're going to put some pen to paper on this, because we promised at the beginning, we committed at the beginning that we would see what we come up with in 2 hours. And that might mean that we don't need, co-creation does not mean that we all have to unanimously vote for the outcome. It might simply mean that all of the voices are in there, and then we've got enough people saying, yes, I'm in support, and everyone else saying, I can live with that. It's not the way I would have chosen to do it, but I can live with that outcome. It's one of many possible ways forward. So you can see what's going on here. You've got to get this balance right between co-creation and consensus building. They're not the same thing again. And these are all these, again, C words, consensus. These are all these C words that get confused in the context of collaboration. So what have we got? We've got, first of all, get that question really clearly stated at the center of the conversation, at the center of the table. Write it up really clearly. The second one was this idea of allocating time really clearly and time boxing that as well. So putting some boundaries around this, making it tight, putting some tension, creative tension. I love that idea of creative tension around it. The third thing is assemble diversity. So think about this conversation, this co-creation actually needs to be, like if I'm a theatre director and I'm directing a play, I need to cast this for the best possible result. So every time you are setting up a kind of co-creation, cast it. If we've got 20 people in the team, it's not an open ticket to say everything that we co-create, we should just ask all 20 to just rock up. That might not be a good use because we might have 3 or 4 people who would have such similar views on things that they're not really going to bring much diversity to the table. It's not a good use of our time. Secondly, this 20 people might be missing 3 or 4 perspectives that aren't represented in this group. We need to bring some people in. So now that I've got the question clear, the outcome or the sort of the idea that we're wrestling with, the time box around it, now I can cast it and assemble. I love this word assemble because it reminds me of the Avengers. Assemble diversity. Who do we need in this conversation? Whose voice do we need? Not by name, but in terms of experience, in terms of what background, what angle. We need someone with a customer lens. We need someone with a technical lens. We need somebody who hasn't been here for more than 6 months so that they think of things differently. It'd be great to get someone who is, completely different culturally background, in terms of cultural background or in terms of generational, where they sit. All of these things I'm now casting and looking, what are the roles that I need to fill here and working backwards from the role. I think that is really critical for co-creation because without ensuring we've got the right mix of voices at the table, we're missing a really important opportunity to think differently. If indeed that's the goal, if the idea here is not co-creation just to make people happy and to create a sense of inclusion, it's bigger than that. It's co-creation for the sake of doing something better than what any one or smaller group of us might have come up with ourselves. Thinking outside the box. Getting multiple voices into the mix. So assemble diversity is about getting very purposeful, very deliberate about that. And of course, it's one thing to bring them to the table. The other thing has to be, are we making sure that their voices, that whole diversity of voices, is heard and that they are able to contribute? Diversity is useless if we don't also have inclusive leadership, inclusive processes, inclusive facilitation to weave all those voices into the mix, to allow them not just to be heard, but to actually contribute to the direction that we go in. So that requires some careful design thinking, a bit of masterful facilitation. It's not simply about an audience for the leader or with the leader. Okay, and now let's talk about the fourth and final thing that comes to mind on this. So we've got, what have we talked about? We've talked about get that question clearly stated. We've then talked about allocating time and in fact time boxing. We've now talked about assembling diversity. I use that voice and accent because it reminds me of the Avengers. I don't know why. And the fourth is, for me, it's about celebrating progress. Which is, in other words, to have fun with this and to make it awesome. Which I talk about this because it's really easy when you bring a group of people together to co-create, to have, 1 or 2 people who still might be in a senior role, who sit there with a kind of like patient listening eyes, nodding, maybe stroking their chin. But you can also see that they're thinking, will this work? In other words, they're really almost auditioning a bunch of ideas before they go, I'm going to have to make a call on this. And maybe their eyes are wide open because they're also thinking, whoa, I don't know what to do with all this juicy input. Like this is outside my pay grade. And so we're going to encounter that kind of resistance. So co-creation requires us not only to have the process in place that assembles and hears and allows all this diverse perspective into the room and into the mix, but Now, by celebrating progress, we can say we should, at every step along the way, and if I'm the senior leader in the room, I should stop and go, you know what's really cool about this conversation? I think we've got a couple of perspectives we've just not talked about before. Or we're hearing from some voices that we don't normally hear from in conversations like this. Or you know what else I'm celebrating is the fact that I feel a little bit out of my depth right now, which is probably a great thing. The fact that I am now feeling out of my depth means I can't control this, which means maybe we're going somewhere good with this. Like this is so exciting. This is so different. It is outside my existing kind of language or my existing map of how we do things around here. How exciting. So at every step along the way, stepping back to go, okay, how can I celebrate here? What are we learning about how we work? What do we learn about how we've worked up until now? And realizing, you know what, we don't create enough space for this. Let's celebrate the fact that so much is coming from it and there's so much energy in the room. Let's make sure we do it again. So by acknowledging and celebrating that stuff, you now let go of it all being about the result. Have we got the outcome we needed? Is this going to fly? To also, hey, we're not there yet, but let's be really appreciative and value what's happening in this conversation and in this room. Learning. You know what I thought of, there's so many examples you could think of this, but you know who does do this really well is particularly those companies, and I've worked with a few of them that are typically very tech heavy, digital based companies who run what are called hackathons. Perhaps that's something you've heard of before, but a hackathon is typically a dedicated period of time, window of time. It might be a couple of days, it might be a week, it might be a whole month. Famously, Google talked about 20% of all time being dedicated effectively towards, they weren't called hackathons, but to this sort of thing. Hackathons are a great way of saying, let's, allow people to assemble into teams, not the people you normally would work with, encouraging you to assemble a diverse group of people, your Wonder Team, your Avengers, assemble them together. Let's give you this window of time. And then you choose a problem or pick a question that we should be tackling as a business. Maybe there's a queue of them that already exists. And once you've picked and locked that in, maybe there's a bit of a refinement and audition process first around, are we asking the right question? Once you've done that, now go wild. You've got your period of time to come up with the craziest solution away from the tools. And then come back and pitch your ideas. And as a collective, we'll decide what should fly, what should happen. We'll celebrate with, not just pizza and Diet Coke. We'll celebrate with awards, with, you see it in LinkedIn if you've got some of these companies in your feed, the celebration of the teams that have come up with awesome ideas that are going to change the way the direction of the company. What a great example of harnessing co-creation. And I think if you reflect a little bit more on how do we as a team embed some of those processes and ways of thinking amidst the busyness of just getting the work done, delivering and making sure we're each doing our bit to contribute to cumulative success, that picture of the unfolding monster. What are we doing to come up with a completely different way of thinking? There you go. That's my riff for today on co-creation. It's been top of mind quite a lot lately. Speaking of co-creation, of course, these conversations are shaped heavily by the conversations, the scenarios that I find myself in the days, weeks, minutes, hours leading up to them. It's typically top of mind stuff, which means if you want to be part of the co-creation of episodes like this, you just have to hit me up with an email. There is an email you can get me at. It's podcast. Easy to remember, podcast@simondowling.com.au. If you email me with thoughts, questions, ideas, that will help feed into the riff that make these episodes and also helps me to know that we are tackling the problems, the questions, the challenges that are very real to you around harnessing the power of teams and groups. How do you make that really work in the context of the modern organisation? Awesome to be with you again. I shall see you in the next episode. Until then, keep in touch. Remember to hit that subscribe button if you have enjoyed this episode or think others might as well. Leave a rating, leave a review. And lastly, but not leastly, if you want to keep in touch more broadly, you can find me over at simondowling.com.au, and that's also where you can sign up to be a member of my mailing list, I send out a fortnightly newsletter. At the moment, the theme of that is something to try and 3 reasons why. If that sounds of interest to you, then please do sign up. But otherwise, I shall see you next time. Bye for now.